That sonata may not be a Glenn Gould performance, but I must say it's good as Gould.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we went, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week, we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while. Watch it and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the Glenn Gould to my Steinway Grand Piano CD 318. Nate wrote the copy for this one. My co-host, Nate Storing. How are you today, my friend?
Good, yeah. I feel like dancing to the sound of my own music.
Yeah, I bet you do. And today, we are talking about the film 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould from 1993, which you might remember from such Simpson episodes as 22 Short Films About Springfield. And we're doing something a little special here, something we haven't tried before. This is actually going to be sort of like a two-parter episode, which is to say we're talking about 22 short films twice. We're not going to be talking about 32 short films about Glenn Gould twice because I don't think we have that much to say about it. But this is such a classic episode that we love so much. We didn't want to just, talk about one film related to it. But today we are talking about 32 short films about Glenn Gould. And why don't we just launch into it? 22 short films about Springfield, season 7, episode 21, directed by Jim Reardon, written by Richard Appel, David X. Cohen, Jonathan Collier, Jennifer Crittenden, Greg Daniels, Brent Forrester, Rachel Polito, Steve Tompkins, Bill Oakley, Josh Weinstein, and Matt Groening. Original air date April 14th, 1996. Nate, what do you have to say about this classic Simpsons episode?
I mean, it's one of the best, right? I mean, it's an episode that was one of those really formative ones when we were in high school. One that we quoted so much that the words probably lost all meaning.
Yes.
I feel like it perfectly encapsulates the philosophy of the Oakley and Weinstein years running the show, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Where they really shifted the attention away in a lot of ways from the family to the broader Springfield cast of characters. And this episode just so showcases how strong those characters end up being and that they have all these fun nooks and crannies that go beyond just a catchphrase or a shtick to being really rich and something that you can mine pretty deeply. So yeah, it's one of the best. What can I say? What about you?
Well, I've said this how many times throughout the recording of this entire podcast. It's one of my top 10 favorite episodes.
Yeah, we're going to have to hold you to this. I'm going to have to make a list and see how many have you actually said are in your top 10.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the very long 10. I think the thing that I would say, though, I think is kind of interesting about the fact that we love this episode so much is that this episode, I think, probably when we were in university, kind of became very memey and had started to, mostly because of steamed hams. But I think its popularity grew in that period. But I think for us, we sort of fell in love with it very much organically and because of sort of our own inside joke memes that our friend group created. So it's this weird thing of I guess it sort of speaks to what a great episode it is that it was our favorite and then it turned out to become the internet's favorite, 5 or 10 years later.
Right, totally. Yeah, I mean, I feel like steamed hams was always hilarious.
No, Mother, it's just the Northern Lights.
That whole sequence with Skinner and Superintendent Chalmers always was, was hilarious. But for us, I feel like the parts that we often were quoting was donuts, I've got donuts. Yes. Hi, I know you, right? That, and then the very tall man.
Do you find something comical about my appearance when I am driving my automobile?
Yeah.
This was the largest auto that I could afford. Should I, therefore, be made the subject of fun?
I guess so.
Would you like it if I laughed at your misfortune?
Well, and it's actually funny, too, because the other thing that I literally can recite from memory, and I did it while watching the episode again this evening, is the Pulp Fiction parody. And we're going to talk about that a lot in our next episode. But when they're doing the Krusty Burger with cheese thing, and I realized that the reason that I know it so well, and this really just sort of, once again, dates us very heavily, but prior to having Disney Plus and prior to even having Simpsons DVDs, what we had was Napster and LimeWire and Kazaa. And I was that weird kid that would download Simpson clips, like MP3s, and then burn them to CD. And so I distinctly remember that this is true, I had the Krusty Burger with cheese sort of like segment, and I would make mix CDs and kind of like, I don't know if you remember like Adam Sandler CDs, but there was that thing on comedy albums where they would have like skits and then songs. And so I would make like mix CDs, and that's what I would kind of do, is I'd put like Simpson quote and then like 3 songs, and then like Simpsons clip and then 3 songs. So that the whole Krusty Burger with cheese thing I had on a CD, and so I just I listened to it so much that it kind of became ingrained in my memory. And so maybe that's part of why, again, like subconsciously this episode resonates with me so much. It's just because I literally can recite it from memory if I had to.
So I gotta ask, I mean, obviously we'll talk more about the Pulp Fiction parodies then, but did you know that was a Pulp Fiction parody?
Not at all. Not at all.
So you just thought that was like a Simpsons original, or did you kind of have an inkling that it was something else?
I honestly have no idea. Maybe like the file maybe was called like Simpsons Pulp Fiction or something. I don't really remember what the file would have been called. There must have been a reason why I downloaded it beyond it was just like available.
Right.
It might even have been that my cousin, Scott, who is one of our listeners, I did most of my downloading at his house because he had cable and I had dial-up. So I would go to his house and I would just download as much stuff as possible, but also like take advantage of whatever shit he had on his computer. So it's also possible that like he already had that and then I took it from him. I don't honestly remember. But no, I don't think I was aware that scene was a very, very direct parody of the scene in Pulp Fiction.
Right.
And I'm sure when I finally saw Pulp Fiction, I kind of had that like eureka moment of like, hey, isn't that thing from that Simpsons joke that I know like the back of my hand? So.
Yeah. No, that was definitely the case for me with this one, was like having that aha moment with Pulp Fiction for sure. Especially because this isn't like a front to back parody of Pulp Fiction, obviously. It just has like an extended scene that's like right out of the movie, basically.
Well, not several, but a couple extended scenes that are right out of the movie. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But it's not like one of the Halloween episodes where it's clearly a front to back parody. And so you kind of know it's a movie. Probably the first time I watched it, I had no idea that it was a reference to Pulp Fiction. So seeing it was like, oh, this is like right out of that movie.
Well, and again, we're going a little Pulp Fiction deep, but how can you not? But the idea, too, that the episode is sort of made up of multiple stories, which is obviously what Pulp Fiction does. But you know what else also has multiple stories?
Right.
See, talk about a segue.
Very nice. 32 short films about Glenn Gould, which is kind of interesting because in some ways, I would argue that the Simpsons episode, even though I don't think anyone had actually seen this movie when they made this episode, there's a little bit more in common with this movie than with Pulp Fiction.
Yes, I would agree.
Because Pulp Fiction is really only 3 stories that are kind of intertwined, whereas this movie, 32 short films about Glenn Gould, is actually 32 short films that are all spliced together as tiny little segments. I mean, some of these are under a minute, probably, I would say.
Yeah.
And that's kind of more like what the Simpsons episode feels like, where you'll just have a little bit and then it'll fly off to something else, right? But the way that it intertwines is maybe a little bit more like Pulp Fiction than like 32 short films about Glenn Gould.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously before we got into this, because spoiler alert, neither Nathan or I had seen 32 short films about Glenn Gould.
Shocker.
Yeah, we kind of went into this just assuming, oh, well, it's just a title parody and it's nothing else.
Right.
And then it sort of, as we watched it, we're like, okay, there's actually more here in common than maybe we expected. But like, I guess that brings me to the question of, why the hell did they choose this as the title to parody or reference, or like, where did this come from? Because I don't think I'm alone in saying that this is not necessarily a popular film, and I have to imagine that an obscure Canadian movie made by a French-Canadian director was not super popular in the writer's room of The Simpsons circa 1993.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, like, just to clarify, the only reference to this movie in The Simpsons is the title of this one episode. There's no direct parody in the episode. There's no other references throughout. So that's kind of interesting. We haven't done a movie like that yet. That's just a title parody. So these are the deeper cuts of the references on The Simpsons when you look at them. But yeah, like, why this movie? Well, so on the commentary, Bill Oakley actually talks about this, and he says,
It's 22 short films. That's named after, what is it,
32 short films about Glenn Gould, which is some sort of art movie that came out that I never saw, but I love it.
It is a good title.
it is a good title. It's descriptive of what they wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
Because, like, the backstory of this episode, which, you know, again, you could hear on the commentaries, but basically there was a short segment at the end of The Front, right?
Yes.
Which was an episode from a couple seasons before this.
Yeah.
Where they basically tacked on a segment about Ned Flanders that had its own theme song and a little, like, bite-sized scene with him and Rod and Todd.
The show was too short, and they're like, we got to pad this out. So they were like, let's just throw a short on.
Right.
Which is, you know, the beauty of being a cartoon is you can get away with stuff like that. And as someone who has previously worked in television, let me tell you, your show being too heavy is a problem that you can solve. Your show being too short is one of the most difficult problems to solve.
Right. Because you can always cut things down, but producing more content is challenging.
Yeah, not easy.
Right. So basically that, you know, this was their solution to a short show, but Oakley and Weinstein kind of like liked the idea of these shorts, and so they always wanted to integrate them more into the show and have more of them. But the fact was, when they were running the show, the episodes always came in too long, and so they never really got that opportunity. Except they just decided, well, why don't we do a whole episode that's nothing but these shorts?
Right.
And we haven't yet spoken to Bill Oakley, who hopefully will be a guest on the show very shortly. But on the commentary, he sort of says, and then we decided to tie it together with a Pulp Fiction thing. We'll find out. But I kind of wonder if Pulp Fiction was the sort of catalyst where they were like, okay, I see how we can do this now. Right. It's not just like a series of shorts, but it is kind of a little bit intertwined, and they kind of, you know, have these things that connect them. All that to say, in terms of why they chose this movie, I think it was kind of loosely in the zeitgeist. It's something that, like, people might have heard the name of. For example, you actually got a review from Roger Ebert. He gave it 4 stars, right? So it's like, if it's on Roger Ebert, right, or Ebert and Roper, I should say.
Siskel and Ebert.
At that time, yes.
Yeah,
you're right. Then it's kind of in the zeitgeist, right? Like, it may not be a movie that you've seen, but it's probably a movie you've heard of in some way. Much in the same way that, like, Bill Oakley sort of says of, like, it's like this art movie that I know exists, you know, so I know the title, but, like, that's kind of it. And then the other interesting thing is that, like, this is one of the very few times that the title actually appears on the screen.
Right, yeah.
Right? Because it's like, you know, you get that in the Halloween episodes, obviously, but other than that, I think it only happens in 2 other episodes in the first 13 seasons. The Telltale Head and Bart Gets Hit by a Car.
Right.
Which both seemed like kind of random, like, you know, choices for that.
But it's also early enough in the series that the standards had yet to be set.
Right. They were totally still experimenting and figuring it out. Whereas apparently with this one, they actually very intentionally showed the title on the screen because they were worried that people wouldn't get it. Basically.
Okay.
They would start watching and be like, what's going on? Why isn't this like a normal episode of The Simpsons? Where are Bart and Lisa? Where's Homer and Marge?
Right.
And so they decided to actually show it on the screen so it would like set expectations and people would be like, okay, I get it. It's going to be a series of short vignettes, not like what a usual episode is. So that's kind of the other thing that sort of elevates this title reference above most of the other ones because like up to a certain point, people like basically never saw these title references, right?
Yeah.
It was like when they came out on the DVD was when suddenly they became more available and people like really actually knew what episodes were called. You know, I actually,
or if they had that very expensive encyclopedia that I had growing up that my dad bought me, that was sort of when I discovered, you know, that these episodes had titles and like, you know, episode codes and all that stuff. So
right, exactly. I feel like TV Guide also had titles. Maybe
they might have. Yeah,
they might have
that's
for
been,
new episodes.
It's so long ago since I've read a TV Guide, but yeah, maybe.
But you
they
wouldn't
did.
have them all in one place. Like you wouldn't have like a list
exactly.
of all of them, except for those encyclopedias or the DVDs.
Yeah.
So it's like. I feel like after a certain point, they started paying more attention to the titles because they were actually something that people would, you know, get a little bit of a kick out of.
Right.
The other thing that I think is kind of interesting about this is why 22 short films? Mm-hmm. Because obviously, like, it's kind of riffing on the title of this movie, 32 short films about Glenn Gould, but The conclusion I came to was that it's kind of like a promise, because there aren't actually 22 short films in this episode.
Yeah, I meant to
throw that
count,
out.
and then I was enjoying the episode too much to actually track it. So,
Yeah. My theory is that it's kind of like a broad promise of like, you're going to get roughly a minute.
Right. Okay.
It's like This Hour Has 22 Minutes, another fun Canadian reference.
Yeah, I was going to say another Canadian reference.
Right. But yeah, like apparently they just fell in love with the title and didn't bother to even count how many they actually had.
Right. Well, and it's good that they didn't try and cram 22 in, because that would have been too fast and furious. And
well, yeah. And also like committing to a specific number, like maybe that's not a good idea.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. I have a feeling. Yeah, exactly. Fair enough.
We're going to talk a lot more about the episode. We're going to talk more about Pulp Fiction in the next episode. What I wanted to dig into instead is these title parodies. This is one of the things that's kind of neat about actually having this database, is that we can actually like figure stuff out about different types of references on The Simpsons.
Exactly.
The thing I'd say before we get into that is just that like this really has its roots, I think, in Mad Magazine, which comes up a lot in the commentaries whenever you hear interviews with the writers, that obviously Mad Magazine was really influential for them when they were our age, right? When we were watching the show, they were reading Mad Magazine, and it had these movie parodies, and they would always have these sort of snappy title parodies that would go along with the parody of the movie.
Well, snappy is maybe being a bit generous in some cases. Like,
sure, they vary in quality. That's true.
Yeah, like calling MASH mush. You know, but at the same time, like sometimes you're hamstrung by the title of the film. It's not easy to come up with a clever witticism that pokes fun at the movie.
Yes,
but yes,
that's true.
I see what you're getting at.
Yes, but the idea of like wanting to parody a title, I feel like definitely comes from that brand of humor. So when you look though at the types of movies that The Simpsons reference in titles, and you take out all the ones that have other types of parodies, right? So for example, The Wizard of Oz, one of the most referenced movies on The Simpsons, it does have at least one title parody that sort of references the movie, but we're not including that in this list because it has other references.
Yeah, it comes up enough otherwise.
Right. But if you just look at the ones that only have a title reference, like 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould, what you find is these are like way deeper cut movies, like the AFI Top 100, as we've been talking about, or Best Picture winners, top grossing movies. Those are all represented pretty well in movies that are parodied on The Simpsons in general. But when you look at the title parodies that are just title parodies, a lot less. There are half as many of those types of movies on these lists represented in title references than you'd expect, given the title references as a proportion of all references. So that's kind of a statistical thing. But the point being, there's a lot fewer of those well-known movies.
Yes.
So instead, what types of movies do you think that you find like here? Just thinking about some of the titles.
I mean, I don't know what this says about me, but the first one that comes to mind is Sperms of Endearment.
Right,
Which is not an episode title, but it is a reference to a title in the show.
Sure. And James L. Brooks, too.
Yeah, and James L. Brooks. So but that is sort of, I guess you would call that like an adult dramedy. I mean, I don't think that term necessarily had been coined at that point, but like a dramedy.
Yeah.
I would guess like stuff like thrillers, maybe romance movies, if that's a genre.
Sure.
I guess it kind of is.
Sure.
Yeah, put me out of my misery. What are we working with?
Yeah, no. I think you're on the right track. I mean, like broadly, what I would say is they're movies that you wouldn't parody otherwise on The Simpsons.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so that includes some things that maybe would be like, I don't know, too serious or too adult. Right. It also includes things that are too obscure and also things that are maybe too extreme. Those are the broad categories that I would say. So you have things like B movies, right? The Brother from Another Planet, Maximum Overdrive. They Saved Hitler's Brain. Right? These are the types of movies that are referenced pretty much only in title parodies.
Right.
You have some comedies that are like more on the intellectual or like black comedy side of things. So The Front,
which is literally the title
that's
of an
not
episode,
even a parody. They just took the title. Take the Money and Run, right?
Okay.
So Woody Allen sort of stuff. The War of the Roses.
Yeah.
And then you have your sex dramas and thrillers.
One of my favorite genres,
Yeah.
and I'm not joking.
Really? Oh, man.
Well, maybe not sex dramas,
Okay.
but thrillers I love.
Well, I love thrillers, but not sex thrillers. I'm not a big sex thrillers guy.
Yeah, I have a soft spot for some of them.
Interesting. Okay, well, maybe we'll have to cover one of those. Yeah, I think they've like parodied maybe Indecent Proposal.
Right, yes.
But I think that might be like the only sex thriller that they properly parody on The Simpsons.
Right.
So instead, you get it in the titles. You have Blame It on Rio. You have Eyes Wide Shut. You have Last Tango in Paris, right?
Incidentally, I'm very glad that they only title parody Last Tango in Paris, because that is
leave that one.
Let's just we'll just set that one aside. No good can come of that.
Yeah. Well, someone else will cover that on a different podcast. Like, you must remember this. They'll do a much better job of covering that one. So the other one that comes up is movies about touchy subjects. Right? So again, things that they don't really address on The Simpsons. Maybe they actually could address some of these things on The Simpsons. Maybe they have in later seasons. But you have The Crying Game.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Sophie's Choice.
Okay,
And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which again, like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, maybe they like should do more stuff like that on The Simpsons.
But what's interesting, well, okay, oh no, I'll keep going,
Okay.
and I'll save this for my next point. Yeah.
Okay. And then the last category, which really brings us to our current movie, is like art movies, indie movies, foreign films, stuff that just like fewer people would have seen potentially.
Right.
So like Boys in the Hood, Smila's Sense of Snow.
Which I literally had no idea was a thing, but fair enough.
Yep. Skinner's Sense of Snow. And of course, 32 short films about Glenn Gould. So those are the kind of the broad categories of stuff. But it's like, this is where you find all the weird movies are in the title parodies.
But see, it's interesting because I'm looking at your list here, and like, I guess what I'm surprised by is the fact that even though these are only title parodies, and they're maybe not movies that people have necessarily always seen, these are films that I'm like familiar with.
Totally.
Or more familiar with than I would have thought. Like Last Temptation of Christ, Crying Game, Sophie's Choice, Days of Wine and Roses, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Barton Fink, Das Boot, Natural Born Killers, Reality Bites, Starship Troopers. Like, I understand why they couldn't necessarily parody these, but these are not things that are coming completely out of left field and people be like, what the hell is that?
Totally.
Like, they, at least if it's the episode title, like, in the case of Guess Who's Coming to Criticize Dinner, like, it's not like someone's going to be like, oh, like, what does that mean? Whereas I guess in some cases, like Smila's Sense of Snow, like, that is coming totally out of left field. And
Right.
So it is kind of interesting, the balance there.
What I would guess is that most of these still reflect the taste of the writers, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, clearly in this case, this was not a movie that, at least Oakley had seen, but, a lot of these, I'm guessing, are movies that they had seen.
Right.
Again, you have Eyes Wide Shut. We know that they're Kubrick fans, and they just knew that they probably are never going to, or they couldn't, at least at that time, parody that movie directly because it's pretty explicit, right?
The one that is really shocking to me is, well, the aforementioned Last Tango in Paris, but also I Am Curious Yellow, because that is sort of like this famous Swedish sex movie that I think is pretty tame by today's standards, but in the 70s was like seriously controversial. And it was like this way of like Eastern intellectuals were able to see sex on film, but it was like, oh, well, but it's in an art film, so it's okay.
Right.
It's not pornography, right? Like it's, Deep Throat is in the other theater, but we're going to go see this Swedish film.
It's Swedish, so it's not pornography, in other words.
Exactly. But it is interesting that like that's the kind of thing that The Simpsons, they're big enough cinephiles or nerds or whatever they are, that's something that they were like, well, we can use this as a parody. They know their audience. They know that their audience is probably going to know what that is, which I also think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, at least some part of their audience, like the other people like them, because I do feel like there's always a little bit of humor that's kind of tucked in there for the deeply nerdy or the people who will kind of appreciate that weird, subtle reference. I do feel like there's a strain of humor in The Simpsons where they're sort of hiding something very sinister or very explicit just below the surface of a joke. Even like some of the scene parodies where they're building like murder scenes or things like that into The Simpsons in a way that like if you don't know the reference, you don't know quite how sinister it is.
Right.
I mean, we'll talk about it in the next episode, but like one of the classic examples for me is in the Pulp Fiction parody in this episode, you have this moment where you have Wiggum and and Snake tied up with their ball gags, and you hear the doorbell ring, and Herman goes and answers the door, and it's Kirk and Milhouse, right?
Yeah.
In the movie, it's this character Zed, who ends up being like a terrifying white supremacist racist, right?
Yeah.
In the parody, like, it's just below the surface. And if you know the movie, you can kind of make the connection that they're like, you know, who's the exact opposite of Zed? Well, it's probably the Van Houtens,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like they're always kind of just coming up to the line of some of those more like explicit or disturbing movie references too.
I want to jump into the movie itself, but before we do, I caught a joke which I have never seen before.
Oh.
I've watched this episode so many times, and I'm going to chalk it up to the HD. I guess it was more in my mind because of our very, very first episode of our podcast where we talked about the autogyro. And I don't know if you caught that when Smithers and Burns are on the tandem bicycle, Mr. Burns is reading Autogyro Enthusiast magazine. And I have never noticed that before.
No, me neither.
But I noticed it tonight, and I was like, well, autogyro is now like permanently etched in my brain because of how much we talked about it in that first episode. So
Yeah, what was it called again? Little
Nelly.
Little Nelly. There you
Nelly.
go. The autogyro. Amazing.
Yeah, so there you go.
I love that. I've never noticed that either.
Yeah. Well, so it just goes to show this episode really is the episode that keeps on giving, because I've lost count of how many times I've seen this, and I'm still catching new jokes. So with that, let's talk about 32 short films about Glenn Gould. I almost said Springfield there, and I caught myself.
It's really tough to not call it by the Simpsons episode. Yeah, well, Adam, I want to ask you, how would you sum up this movie in a sentence?
Okay. A non-traditional biopic of the life and times of Glenn Gould told through 32 short films.
Yeah, I feel like it's a trick question because the title actually is the answer to this question.
It's quite literally the perfect summation of the film.
What you see is what you get, right?
Yeah, it's very much what it says on the tin. That's the movie,
Right, but I feel like the trick
for
is,
better or for worse.
Yeah, and I think the trick is, do you know who Glenn Gould is?
This I do know. I do actually know who Glenn Gould is. I mean, part of
interesting.
this is because I'm a good Canadian, and I feel like every Canadian kind of knows in the back, like, he is one of our most famous musicians.
Sure.
I obviously worked near and walked by the CBC, and the CBC famously has like a statue of Glenn Gould sitting outside of the Glenn Gould. Is it called the Glenn Gould Theater? I can't remember.
Glenn Gould
but
Studio?
He has. Yeah, he has a theater or a studio or whatever named after him at the CBC, and there's this famous bronze statue of him sitting on a bench that everybody knows of. And in high school, the classic joke or trick or gag was that you'd pretend to give Glenn Gould a blowjob. We can maybe cut that, but
I don't remember that joke, but I
know a lot of people who did that, but that's a funny gag. I am familiar with his most iconic work, Bach's Goldberg Variations. It's, a very, very famous recording, and it's good. I'm not a huge classical music guy, but it's one of those seminal recordings of the era, so I've listened to it and enjoyed it. And then I guess over the years, my interest has been piqued enough that I've read up on Glenn Gould, and as the film portrays, he's a very unique, eccentric character.
Yeah, eccentric is the word that comes to mind for me, for sure.
And to the film's credit, one of the best things about it is that as I was watching it, I was like, man, I really need to read up on this guy again. And so I kept pulling up the Wikipedia article to learn more about this bizarre musical genius from our history. But how about you? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you do or did know who he was just based on your family, specifically your brother.
Right.
But is that a fair assumption, or?
Yeah, no, good guess. I mean, so definitely I was familiar with his name, I would say.
Right.
And a little bit about who he was through the fact that my brother is a musician. It's interesting because my brother's more of a new music guy, and Glenn Gould, I don't know that much about the sort of history of music, but my impression is that he was going back to Bach at a time when music was going the other direction. you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
so that's part of the interesting thing about Glenn Gould is that he kind of like made Bach cool again, right? He was kind of a bit of a rock star and gave this different interpretation to Bach that was unusual at the time. It was very energetic. He was known for like humming and changing the tempos and all the stuff that made it exciting again for people, which is kind of hard to, again, we talk about this all the time, hard to kind of put yourself in that place at that time when this would have been really exciting for a certain group of people. Probably people who read the New Yorker and whatnot, you know, like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and the fact that he's getting a biopic emphasizes the importance he has in this realm because, you know, you think about it, you don't make biographies, generally speaking, about like Joe Nobody, like especially musicians, right?
That's,
like,
I mean, yeah, I think that's an interesting question, though, because I think that would be true if this is an American film.
Okay, fair enough.
Right?
But, yeah. Okay.
But I think that there's an interesting. This is going to be an ongoing thing throughout this episode of just like the Canadian system and the American system. Definitely, I think that Glenn Gould was an important historical figure, particularly in Canada, and also I think that like Canadian film production is very focused on trying to identify important Canadians, tell Canadian history, that kind of thing. And so I feel like this movie is kind of both of those things. If this was like an American filmmaker through the American studio system, like being like Glenn Gould's important and it's intended for a commercial audience, that would be a different thing, I think, than what this movie is. So
that being said, the guy won multiple Grammys, and his recording was put on the famous golden record that was sent into space. There's the Voyager sequence in the film, which we may or may not talk about. I don't know. There's 32 of these things to talk about, so I don't know what we're going to actually cover. But famously, there was this golden record that, you know, a bunch of different types of music was recorded onto and sent into space with the idea of, like, I guess if aliens find this and can figure out how to play it, they will learn about the majesty and wonders of Earth's music. But, you know, his recordings are on there. Like, that's no small feat. I mean, other people who are on there, it's a lot of classical music, obviously, but Chuck Berry is in there. Actually, yeah, looking at the list, Chuck Berry is the only other contemporary. Oh, Louis Armstrong. Okay, Louis Armstrong makes the cut. It's basically all classical music, which is wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically classical music and Johnny Be Good and Melancholy Blues by Louis Armstrong. So not even like the classic Louis Armstrong song.
Yeah.
You know, What a Wonderful World.
What a Wonderful World would have been appropriate.
Yeah, it would have been thematically more appropriate. But, you know, NASA. Yeah. They're scientists. They're not musicologists, I guess.
I'm sure they talked to some other people, but, you know.
Yeah, I may have just undercut my entire premise here. But anyway.
I do have to say quickly about the Voyager record. You know how I first learned about the Voyager record?
How did you first learn about the Voyager record, Nate?
Beast Wars.
Yeah, there we go. Yep.
Beast Wars. No, more CanCon, you know?
Yeah, more, no kidding. One of those shows that would, whenever it came on, I was like, oh man, why could there be a Simpson rerun on instead?
Yeah. I loved that show. I thought it was great.
Yeah,
it was very Shakespearean.
I didn't like Beast Wars. I didn't like Transformers. I didn't like Animorphs.
I didn't like Animorphs either, but loved all the Transformers stuff.
Yeah, Digimon, Pokemon.
Okay,
we're talking. This is YTV circa 2002. So
yes, the channel I had on all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Back to the movie.
Yes.
Nate, did you manage to track down a historical synopsis?
I sure did.
Wow.
From the 1994 VHS.
Oh wow! Look at this.
Yes. So this would be the original release of it on home media.
Yeah.
And again, like it is interesting to try to describe this movie to someone else. So let's hear it.
Before we launch into this, I just want to note that on the back of the VHS, there's a little E, and it says videogram, a term I have never heard used for home video, but videogram for which exemption from classification is claimed. So I guess I think it's a fancy way of saying this is not rated. Oh. But somehow it was exempt from being rated.
So E for exemption, I guess.
Yeah,
rather than E for everybody, which,
you know. That's for video games. Okay, here we go. This is the 1994 VHS synopsis of 32 short films about Glenn Gould. And now we cue the Glenn Gould music playing in the background, and hailed by critics around the world and winner of 4 Genie Awards, the Canadian Film Prize, including those for Best Picture and Best Director. 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould is a unique cinematic portrayal of the life of the late Glenn Gould, the controversial and eccentric pianist considered one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century. Taking its structure from Bach's Goldberg Variation, perhaps Gould's signature piece, each of the 32 elegantly constructed vignettes represents a variation on the theme of Glenn Gould, depicting the many diverse aspects of his life from age 4 until his untimely death at the age of 50. That would have been good to know going into watching this.
Yeah, and this is actually like, if you're going to expand upon the title, I actually think this is a very good explanation of what you're watching.
Yeah. But I did not know that when I sat down to watch the movie. So knowing
Which
that
part would have been helpful?
Probably the fact that it's like taking the structure from the Bach Goldberg variations. That would maybe have helped.
Yeah.
It would also explain why there's 32 of the damn things.
Yeah. Well, it does, we'll get into it, but like 32 is a lot.
It's arguably too many, Nate.
It's a lot. I like a lot of these, but it does feel like picking that arbitrary number just for the structure of being like, yeah, it's just like the Goldberg variations. It
also
does not necessarily a good movie make.
I texted Nate this, and I could be wrong, but I made a point of writing down the title of each short as it came up, and I did not write down 32 titles. I don't think there's actually 32. I think there's 31. I think it's 31 short films. Maybe I blinked and I missed something.
It may be,
but
I think it may be that the last segment doesn't have a title.
No, because I'm not including, because this is my original count didn't take into account the first and last segment, which is essentially like, I would argue is the same segment because it's him like walking towards and then walking away. But even accounting for those,
that's the same as the Goldberg variations. To be
yes,
fair.
and I understand that. But I'm just saying, even once I accounted for those, that still brought my count up to 31. So I don't really know. Anyway, needless to say, I didn't like the film enough to go back and rewatch it and recount. So
you blinked and you missed one, or I don't know. Or maybe you're right. Maybe there is only 31 and they're just testing us.
Yeah, it's a big conspiracy. Yeah. We'll take it up with Francois Girard. To that point, Nate, how did this thing come to be? Beyond it was Canadian.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. And like when I do research for this show, often I go to the AFI catalog, right, to get this part about film production background. It's always so helpful because it's well researched and it actually digs into the production of like how something gets made. It's a lot harder to find stuff past their cutoff date. It's a lot harder to find stuff internationally. So I'm very grateful that I was able to actually find information about this movie. So in 1979, Niv Fishman, I'm guessing, or Fickman, and 2 friends from York University started Rhombus Media, at least partly to make a movie about Glenn Gould.
Interesting.
Yeah.
One of my very good friends used to work at Rhombus Media, so I am familiar with Rhombus. And actually, I'm already steering this off the tracks, but they produced. Did you see that Denis Villeneuve Enemy with Jake Gyllenhaal?
Not yet. I need to dig into his broader filmography.
That's one of their like more popular recent films. They produced a bunch of Cronenberg movies, including Cronenberg's Sons movie, Antiviral, Hobo with a Shotgun. Do you remember Hobo with a Shotgun?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that was them. Passchendaele, starring your absolute favorite Canadian actor Paul Gross.
I've seen that one.
Yeah, I know you have. So yeah, anyway, needless to say, Rhombus is like, they're kind of a big player in the like Canadian indie production world.
For sure. And kind of, it seems like have a bit of a pipeline or connection to York University as well.
Right.
And their film folks. So yeah, Fickman and her friends used to hang out at Glenn Gould's hotel residence. And became kind of obsessed with him.
Interesting.
Because one of her friends actually worked behind, I think, the bar there. And so kind of like got to know him informally that way. But then after Gould died in 1982, they put this plan, this hope for like making a movie about his life on hold because it just didn't feel like the right time. right?
Interesting. That's maybe the most Canadian thing I've ever heard, because I feel like in Hollywood they would have like used that as an opportunity to like pounce,
Right.
whereas us being the kind, gentler types, we're like, oh no, now is not appropriate. We shall wait.
That's true. Yeah, for sure. Flash forward to 1990, and Fickman is working with Francois Girard. I think they were just wrapping up another movie, and Girard suggests doing a movie about Gould.
Oh, okay.
And Fickman is like, oh my God, yeah, of course. And all these memories start coming back, and they decide, like, yeah, this is definitely what we need to do. This is the next project.
Right.
So, as the description on the back of the VHS says, it's modeled after Bach's Goldberg variations. Basically, you have like 30 main vignettes in the middle, and then in the Goldberg variations, you have an aria at the beginning and end that's kind of like one piece cut in two. And so the movie's very similar. As you said, it sort of begins and ends with him like walking across this sort of frozen tundra, walking towards the camera and then walking away from the camera. And that's kind of the aria part of it. Originally, they wanted to do this as a TV movie.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes. Well, and again, like it speaks to the sort of specifics of like Canadian film production, right? Where like TV rights and TV broadcasting are really like an important part of the ecosystem. And I think at this time, if I'm not mistaken, the way that sort of government funding and incentives were all kind of set up, it was all blended together, right?
Yep.
TV rights and film distribution were all kind of like in the mix together as part of these deals. So yeah, it was originally imagined that way, but then they actually had to kind of make it a theatrical release in order to secure the funding necessary to make the movie.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay.
So Max Films ended up distributing it theatrically, but Rhombus retained the TV rights.
Interesting. I mean, that is the beauty of the structure, is that you could very easily put commercial breaks in this.
Totally.
So it totally makes sense that it sort of comes out of that. That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other interesting thing, of course, is that eventually Don McKellar comes on to actually write the script, because Francois Girard is French speaking and didn't feel like he could quite get the nuance of the script. And so McKellar was able to add some of the humor in it and some of the nuance of the language.
And has a cameo in the film as well.
Oh, does he? Where is Don McKellar?
Yeah, when he does the concert in LA and the like manager comes to speak to him backstage, that's Don McKellar.
Oh, okay.
A very young Don McKellar.
Interesting. I have to admit, I'm not that up on the Canadian film scene, but Don McKellar, I gather, is a pretty important figure. So who is Don McKellar?
Yeah, I mean, you're putting me on the spot.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I would say, despite the fact that I worked for the Toronto International Film Festival for 7 years, I am not as well versed in Canadian film as I probably should be. But Don McKellar, yeah, he is a famous sort of actor / writer / director. He's just one of these like Canadian cinema characters that kind of shows up a lot in films by famous Canadian filmmakers.
Right.
He's in a couple of Francois Girard's films, including The Red Violin. He's in a couple of Cronenberg movies. He's in a couple Adam Agoyan movies. Yep. They're all sort of intertwined. He worked on Slings and Arrows, a show that your mother loves.
Yeah. Good memory.
He worked on the musical The Drowsy Chaperone. You know what you have seen him in? In Scott Pilgrim. When they are shooting the movie at Casa Loma, he plays the director.
Oh,
because that's
that.
sort of like Edgar Wright's little nod to like Canadian cinema.
Very nice.
So yeah, he's been around. He's a nice guy. Like I've met him once. Like he's
big advocate. I gather for Canadian film, involved in kind of like trying to push for better policy and all of that, which is important in Canada.
Yeah, he's on boards. He's kind of this like omnipresent figure.
One of those guys. So that's kind of basically how this movie came together, right? People who really felt kind of touched by Glenn Gould and how eccentric he was, but also important to music of the time, and also kind of just an important Canadian figure, right? Again, going back to that, one of the interesting things about him as a person is he was a famous performer at a pretty young age. From like 15, I think, till he was about 30. And then at the age of 30, he was like, I am not performing live ever again. and I'm going to focus 100% of my time on recordings.
Kind of pulled the Beatles in a way.
Yeah, it's a good call. Yeah, totally. That just kind of course, adds to the whole mystique of who he is. And he wrote a lot about and gave a lot of interviews about like why he did this and the importance of recording as a medium. Very interesting guy that way. Because of that, he was just kind of a guy who was also around Toronto and like was a figure that you'd hear interviewed and read something by and you'd hear stories about because he was around. Like, I actually think that sculpture of him sitting on the bench talking, right, is kind of a good encapsulation of what I think of when I think of Glenn Gould as kind of this guy who was around.
And then, they show this in the film, but he goes on to make like radio documentaries. I think my understanding is he has like a long history with the CBC. All of this is sort of like tied up in like Canadiana. And for our non-Canadian listeners, like this probably all sounds utterly insane, but it's like Canada has a very unique arts space in that it is well funded but not highly regarded within its own country.
Well, I think I would push back on that a little bit. I think the way that I kind of see it now, having like lived in the American system, is that it's, to a certain extent, this is a broad generalization, but I do think that there's a bit of like art for artists in Canada.
Yeah, it's art for art's sake, not art for commercial sake.
Right. And so,
I would say.
And like a lot of the funding is like, by definition, it's evaluated by your peers. Yeah. And so what makes good art is very much like what other artists in your field think is good art. And so for that reason, it can be definitely more experimental at times, but also maybe a little bit more insular. There's less sort of like drive for it to be commercial. I think that's changed a little bit in film, especially in recent years, but in this period especially, it's a little bit more artistic, but with the mission of like helping Canadians learn about what Canada's all about. Like that's a big part.
There's always a very heavy like patriotism slant. But what I was trying to get at is, unlike say, like the cinema of France or the cinema of Italy or the cinema of Japan, Canadian film is this weird thing where it's like, outside of French Canadian film, because the whole Québécois system is completely different and very, very successful.
Totally.
But English-speaking Canadian film kind of is this weird thing of like, it's not really popular amongst Canadians, but it also doesn't have the same international draw as other international cinema. Right. And so it kind of just like...
because it feels like English Canadian film isn't foreign language film. So like at the Oscars, it's not eligible, right? It's just competing with American films for Best Picture and all that kind of stuff. It's considered part of the domestic box office when you look at those numbers.
Yeah, exactly. And every once in a while something breaks through, but it is interesting. You think of like British cinema and this long illustrious history, and Canadian cinema just has never really compared. So
right, but to be fair too, like part of the problem, again, we're getting deep into the politics of this, but like part of the problem is that Canadian film distribution is so hampered by the fact that all of the cinemas are American chains, basically. And so there isn't that same feedback loop that Hollywood benefits from, of like this sort of pipeline to consumers and kind of hearing what people want and like the system responding, right? Instead, it's like this uphill battle, pretty much.
But I think there's also this added layer of, as I sort of alluded to, stuff that has Canadian arts grants in general. It has to have this level of, we call it CanCon, like it has to have Canadian content.
Yep.
And it creates this sort of like double-edged sword of like, it becomes so distinctly Canadian that it doesn't play as well outside of Canada because Canada doesn't feel different enough to be unique from American culture. But it's too Canadian for Americans to want to take it on or accept. So it's like it becomes this weird thing where the stuff that tends to break through are the things that kind of break away from that overly Canadian tradition. So it's stuff like Flashpoint, which even though it is set in Toronto, they never really say the words Toronto.
Right.
So therefore it can be any metropolitan city in North America.
Right.
Or you have Schitt's Creek, which is, yes, it's supposed to be a small town in Canada, but it could be small town USA. So it's like these things that are able to break through because they are Canadian, but they're not too Canadian.
Right. Or David Cronenberg is a great...
Or David Cronenberg.
Where it's like, again, most of these like technically take place in Canada, or at least they're shot in Canada, but that's not really part of the story, right?
No, exactly. The Fly is not make or break based on the fact that it is set in Toronto, although I'm pretty sure that The Fly is set in Toronto.
Oh, yeah, certainly I think it is.
Yeah.
All the locations, if you know Toronto, it feels quite Torontonian.
Yeah, one of my favorite shows of all time, Genesis, is a Canadian show. I think I've talked about it on the show before. It is very distinctly set in Toronto. They play up the fact that it is set in Toronto, and it's really interesting because they also play into American politics because it was set during the sort of like Bush administration. Anyway, it's all this to say is that if you're not Canadian, I'm sure watching this would be even more like obtuse and hard to parse.
Yes, coming back to the movie itself, I totally agree. I feel like if you don't understand the sort of like Canadian film landscape and you just flip this on, I think there are a lot of things in this movie that you'd be like, what the hell am I watching?
Well, this is a really great segue. We were going to talk about this later, but I want to talk about it now because it is a perfect segue. You watched the film before I did, and you texted me, and you're like, I don't know, like, I'm kind of digging it, but man, this really feels like an NFB movie.
Yeah.
And I knew what you meant, but like, to our listeners, what do you mean by that?
Totally. So, okay, NFB is the National Film Board of Canada, which is a big producer of CanCon. But it's almost also like its own style in a lot of ways.
It very much so, yes.
It's probably best known, I would say, for its animation. Lots of really important animators came out of the NFB. In this movie, you have one segment called Gould Meets McLaren, something like that, right? And McLaren is a really well-known animator who came out of NFB. Like, the best comp that I would give, like, for Americans who don't know what the hell I'm talking about, is, like, you remember those animated segments that were part of Sesame Street?
100%.
That were kind of, like, a little bit abstract, but, like, fun and interesting, too?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Especially McLaren really feels like that. It's, like...
100%.
It's, like abstract shapes and music and sounds and, like, stuff like that happening. It's got that kind of vibe, and it's kind of that era. You can definitely see that kind of experimental animation in this movie. They're also really well known for documentaries.
Yes.
Another thing that's integrated into this movie is these like interview segments with people who actually knew Glenn Gould. So there's that. And then I think the overriding thing is kind of what you've been saying of... It's kind of like the eat your vegetables Canadiana stuff of like...
That's a really good way to describe it.
Yeah, of just like, thou shalt know thy Canadian culture. These are the important people you must know. These are the important pieces of history you must know. There are some things that I deeply appreciate about that. And also, I think, especially growing up in the 1990s, there was a little bit of a pushback against that among people our age, but mostly through humor, ironically appreciating this stuff and kind of laughing about it. Like the classic thing is Heritage Minutes.
Oh, yeah.
So, Adam, what's a Heritage Minute?
So a Heritage Minute is a short film, about a minute, about a part of our heritage. So it would be like... I mean, I don't think there's like an American equivalent of this.
They're PSAs. Yeah, they're
PSAs that would run on television in lieu of a commercial break. You would get this Heritage Minute. So there was a recent one about Viola Desmond, who has sort of been referred to as Canada's Rosa Parks. The one that my friends in grade school we used to always reference was John Cabot finding the cod.
Codfish, so thick they stayed the progress of our
because again, it's like the Canadian, our history is, I think there was one about like us burning down the White House, because that's the thing that we always like to talk about.
I don't remember that one, but that's just one of those anecdotes that was always floating around.
Yeah,
as kids, 'cause we're like,
in Flanders Field, the guy who wrote that poem, John McCrae. There was definitely a John McCrae one.
The one that I always remember was the brain surgery one, where about the people who discovered seizures. Right. And so they're like operating on a woman's brain, and then she just goes,
now what? What is it, Mrs. Gould?
Burnt toast. Dr. Penfield, I can smell burnt toast.
Right.
It was always stuff like that. And there were always...
Oh!
Yeah.
The other one I remember is the guy who invented basketball. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That one, for whatever reason, that one got a lot of airplay.
What if we cut the bottom out of it?
Yeah, exactly. That one got a lot of airplay on YTV.
Yeah. I mean, like, but the thing that I always think is really distinctive about these is they always had a sort of line in the script that summed up the historical moment, like, I smell burnt toast.
Yeah.
The other one that I remember was Marshall McLuhan, which is relevant to this movie as well. But like, he's like wandering around the classroom, like talking about TV and the global village and blah, 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 blah. And then he like mutters to himself, the medium is the message, right? It was always something like that.
Yeah, they're corny, but
heavy-handed.
They are a part of our heritage. In a weird way, they've become their own heritage. There should be a heritage minute about the making of the heritage minute.
Yes, there should. I totally agree.
Going back to the NFB thing, like my relationship with NFB stuff, like with most Canadians, our knowledge of them comes from school. A lot of the sort of science and nature programs you'd watch in grade school, science class, or like social studies, they were always NFB things because it was like they were produced by the government. And so there was usually some sort of like pro-government message or like environmental message. Eat your vegetables is a perfect way to put it. That's not to say that there isn't great stuff coming out of the NFB, but there is this vibe to it that at least in our Simpsons watching era, if you saw that eye logo come up, you'd be like, oh no, oh man.
But the thing
we're
is,
gonna watch one of these.
But like it weirdly did create its own Canadian culture. But the culture wasn't us directly taking all of this history and being like, I feel great about being Canadian. It was more like, isn't it weird that this is being jammed down our throats? And and we would be quoting the heritage minutes on the playground to each other because we thought it was funny. So again, there's sort of this like ironic interpretation of official Canadian culture that I think is part of this whole CanCon aesthetic. The interesting thing is that like I feel like Canadian film especially has really moved on from this at this point.
Very much so.
And I might be wrong. Again, like I'm not so up to speed on all the ins and outs of Canadian film, but I do feel like Bon Cop, Bad Cop was a really important turning point because it did actually get like, at least in Canada, got like a pretty popular reception. It wasn't just like an eat your vegetables thing, but also was very distinctively Canadian about an Ontario cop and a Quebec cop having to work together to solve a case about like someone who died right on the border. And like,
it's a great movie.
It's a great movie. And like, you know, the sort of relationship between Anglo-Canada and Franco-Canada. And it's kind of like an 80s black cop, white cop setup that you'd see in American movies. It's sort of a play on that, but playing on the sort of Canadian politics. And it also includes Colm Feore, who stars in this movie. But I feel like after that, you get a lot more of this sort of like populist movie making that is a little bit less concerned with the sort of eat your vegetables stuff.
Including, but not limited to, last year's smash hit, in my opinion, Blackberry.
Yeah.
You know, that's a perfect example of it's got funding from the CBC, but it doesn't feel like an eat your vegetables CanCon movie. Like it feels like a, for lack of a better term, and I no disrespect to my fellow Canadian filmmakers, it feels like a real movie.
I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. Part of it is that like, yes, it's telling a distinctly Canadian story, but it's also not, wow, weren't these people great story. It's warts and all in a way that, while I do kind of enjoy this movie, it is very much like, wasn't Glenn Gould important? That's the thing that I think you're primarily meant to take away from it is like, he was enigmatic and important. I think we've gotten a little bit away from that style of filmmaking for the better in terms of Canadian cinema.
Well, that's maybe a good segue just to talk about the actual film itself and what it is and its structure, because this is ostensibly a biopic,
right?
Albeit not told in a sort of traditional biopic structure. What were your feelings on that, Nate? Did you like this style, or did you find it obnoxious, or like what was your take?
I mean, I think overall, like the concept of it, I appreciate, especially for someone like Glenn Gould. Seems like he was, again, eccentric, maybe a little bit hard to understand what exactly was going on in his head or what in his personal life. And so it's like to try to create the definitive story, cradle to grave of like who he was and what he was all about. Maybe that's an impossible standard, and maybe it's more truthful and interesting to kind of show a bunch of different angles on this person. It's kind of like a cubist portrait of Glenn Gould.
Right.
Yeah, I like that.
I like that.
What is your thoughts and feelings on biopics in general? Like, are you for them, against that? Because I know, like, they're kind of a genre that I feel like people have pretty strong takes on. Like, I want to say, like, it's very much a you either love them or hate them genre.
Yeah, I'm definitely more on the hate side. I really...
Okay, that's kind of... That's what I assumed.
I have a high bar for biopics because I just do find them very formulaic, right?
Yeah.
And
they are. Generally speaking, they are very formulaic. Like you said, from like cradle to grave, that tends to be the approach. And, sometimes that works well and other times less so.
Yeah. I think a great counterpoint to this movie would be to think about like Maestro from last year, right? Which is not quite a cradle to grave, but is very much trying to capture this whole person's life, tell a very like coherent A to B story about like who they were, what they were about. And I didn't love it, I mean...
I hated that movie.
Yeah.
But I would say it's actually kind of an interesting comparison in that one of the criticisms that was sort of leveled at Maestro is that they kind of assume you understand the importance of Bernstein.
Right.
And, like, it doesn't focus on his craft as much as it's more focused on his personality and his personal life and sort of leaves the craft behind.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting take for a biopic about a artist. This is a similar movie where it's just... doesn't always fill in all the blanks or fill in all the lines. You're kind of left to your own devices to sort certain things out, which is why, as I said, to its credit, it had me intrigued enough that I was going on Wikipedia. But I was also going on Wikipedia while the movie was happening because I was trying to fill in some of the gaps that I was like, what is happening right now?
Yeah, it does require a lot of like at least a working understanding of who he was, right? And it's kind of trying to disrupt that in some ways and play off of that in other ways. But if you don't have any of that, I think this movie is almost completely like illegible. Whereas Maestro is definitely much more of like a, here is who this person is, and takes you through their whole life in a lot of ways, and love stories and relationships. And this really does not hold your hand in that way. So it's a trade-off. The reason why there is sort of a formula for biopics, I think, is because it's really hard to tell someone's whole life story. And so having a kind of like arc that we all understand gives you kind of a framework for understanding someone's life and importance and what they struggled with and all of that kind of stuff. And then any deviation from that formula is telling you something about that person. And this is a good counterpoint of the pros and cons of that, where it's like, on one hand, if you know who Glenn Gould is, this movie could be very interesting in helping you understand them more deeply. But if you don't know who Glenn Gould is, you're not going to find out who Glenn Gould is by watching this movie. It's going to be really confusing. So
It's really interesting because one of my early notes was, this is a really interesting premise and structure. And because you can kind of get burned out on the formulaic nature of biopics, I was sort of like, this is kind of cool. Like, I like this. Ultimately, I think 32 is way too many.
Yeah.
And I started to lose interest because they kind of got progressively less interesting to me. But I think there's something to this idea of like a non-traditional biopic that doesn't necessarily have to hit all of the sort of like beats. Like one of the recent ones that came out that I just absolutely despised because I think it felt so formulaic was the Queen biopic or the Freddie Mercury biopic or whatever you want to call it. That movie just felt so paint by numbers that it just did absolutely nothing for me. But you're right in that because this is not sticking to the formula, it would only really work with someone who is arguably so famous that you don't need to cover the standard biopic sort of story beats.
Right.
Like
someone who would be tired of hearing the full cradle to grave. I mean, like Steve Jobs actually is one that it's not quite the same, but you all know who Steve Jobs is. You don't need to see the cradle to grave Steve Jobs story.
That stuff, it's almost irrelevant to who he ultimately became.
Yeah.
So we don't need to see that. I think Steve Jobs is actually a really, really interesting comparison in terms of like, it's a biopic, but it's like not a traditional narrative structure. So I was going to compare it to Batman in a weird way because it's like this idea of like, or any superhero movie where every time they reboot it, they're like, we have to do the origin story again. It's like, no, you don't. Everybody knows how Spider-Man became Spider-Man. Everybody knows how Batman became Batman. Stop wasting my time. Just get into the meat of it. And we've obviously talked about Batman this season, and that's kind of one of the interesting things the Burton film does is that it touches on his parents' murder, but it literally just touches on it. It doesn't really dwell on it.
It's all flashback stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And that kind of works. I feel like Michael Jackson is someone where you could almost do this. And the MJ musical, which is on Broadway right now, kind of does that. It's not a cradle to grave biopic. It's sort of like, we're going to pick one point in time and sort of tell this story. Then we'll touch on little bits here and there, but for the most part, we're just telling this one little period in time. That's sort of one of those celebrities where I feel like everybody kind of knows so much that you don't need to necessarily do that traditional, like, they were born in 1958 and blah, 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 blah kind of structure.
I feel like probably the most direct comparison is a movie that I unfortunately have not seen, so I'll be curious if you have. I'm Not There, the Bob Dylan movie.
Right, I haven't seen it either, but yeah, you're right. That is such a non-traditional, because it's like Bob Dylan's played by like 10 different actors,
right? And it is
including Kate Blanchett,
right? And my understanding is that it is kind of vignette-y as well. So
yeah, I think you're right.
I feel like that would probably be the best comparison, but unfortunately, I have not seen it. So there you go. But I think, like, again, my understanding of that one is that it's not hemmed in by this really strict structure of being like, okay, we got to do 32 of these things. So what are the 32? Because I do think that is probably the greatest weakness of this. Some of these are strong and some of them are not as strong, right?
Yeah.
And some of them really do feel a little bit like filler. That would be my argument.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, one of the things that kind of took me out of the movie was when it suddenly cut to a documentary-style talking head interview with someone who knew him, which, again, is like kind of an interesting structural change from what we're used to. But it reminded me of, did you ever see Frost Nixon?
Yeah.
I kind of dig that movie. Yeah. I know it's not like super well regarded.
I like it too, actually.
But it does that weird thing of like, it has talking heads as if they're interviews, but they're obviously the actors playing the character.
Right.
It breaks the formula a little bit, and it's based on a play, so it's already breaking a lot of formulas. But what did you think of those moments where they kind of like threw out now we're no longer dramatization, we're now just doing straight documentary?
I mean, so what I would say about those segments is structurally or like format-wise, that switch didn't bother me. And maybe it's just because I was like really prepped for sort of what this movie was going to be. And so I was like, yeah, I know this is kind of like mixed media almost, right, in terms of how it's put together. But what I would say is I didn't find the interviews particularly insightful for the most part.
No.
They were meandering, and I don't know, they just didn't reveal a lot about Glenn Gould, in my opinion. The only thing that is interesting about them is that that there's some truthiness going on, right? Like, that you're like, yeah, okay, so like we're watching a dramatization, but then these people actually knew him, and that's actually interesting because they're kind of corroborating what we're seeing or whatever. But yeah, there wasn't a lot of like new information or anything that came out of those. So again, to me, they didn't feel like the strongest segments. Like none of those stand out as favorite moments or even particularly bad moments. They're just kind of there, For me, it was also too, it's just like, you could tell me that they were real people or you could tell me they were actors and I wouldn't like second guess either. It's not like they're super famous people, right?
Which kind of lends credence to, well, they must be the real person. But like, I don't know, like the rest of the movie is actors. Like, what's to say that these aren't all, doing the Frost Nixon thing and these aren't also actors? So it's just, it was an interesting choice that kind of stuck out to me. Maybe the first time they did it, I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then by the third or fourth time, I was like, I'm over this.
Yeah. Well, why don't we actually talk about the segments a little bit? Did you have any like favorite segments or ones that really stood out as stinkers to you?
Yeah, I had a couple favorite segments actually. Because again, I was writing down each title as I went and sort of making notes, and then I would like put a heart next to the ones that I liked, because I figured this was going to come up of like, which ones did you like? So the first one that really sort of made me go, oh, this is interesting, was Gould Meets Gould, which is this sort of like interesting moment where Glenn Gould is conducting an interview with himself.
Right.
And obviously Colm Feore is playing both parts.
To begin, let me ask straight out, are there any off-limit areas? I certainly can't think of any, apart from music, of course. Well, Mr. Gould, I don't want to go back on my word. I realize that your participation in this interview was never contractually confirmed, but I had rather assumed that we'd spend the bulk of the interview on music-related matters. Do you think it's essential?
I'm always kind of blown away by what we would refer to as like split screen photography of like having one actor play two characters in the same scene. I'm always just like, the sheer technical skill on display is always impressive.
Yeah.
It's maybe why I love The Parent Trap so much. But it's sort of the first one where you really get to see Feore play the role, if I'm not mistaken. I should check.
I think there's maybe a moment where one of the vignettes is literally Colm Feore sitting in a chair and looking at the camera.
Yes, you're right.
And that happens, I think, before
one.
this.
Yeah, but so this is the first time we really get to see him doing the Glenn Gould thing. And again, I don't know Glenn Gould so well that I can tell if this is a good impression or not. I don't think it really matters in the end of the day. I'm on record of like, I don't think that is as important as people make it out to be.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's the first time you get to really see him do his thing, and he's excellent at it. So I really, really liked that sequence. Another one that I really liked was CD 318, which is the sequence where it's just like close-ups of a performance, but it's like the hammers hitting the strings, the keys being played. It's like, it's very artsy-fartsy, very NFB, but I just liked the visuals and the look of that. Similarly, Variation in C minor is very NFB in that that's the one where it's just like the waveform. Like it's literally the optical audio and you see the optical visualization.
Yeah, these are very much like the Sesame Street interstitial scenes, which I also really dig. I love that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
The other one I really liked, though, was I liked The Passion According to Gould, which I think is maybe one that you didn't like, but
which one is that?
But that's the one where he's in the recording studio. You know me, I'm like a nerd for old recording technology. I was less interested in the like Glenn Gould part of it, but seeing all the old equipment, and I thought the record producers were really kind of funny, and they're talking about like the coffee and everything.
Yeah, I liked that part of that one for sure.
You really shouldn't be giving this to you. It's not very good for you.
You mean coffee in general, or your coffee?
No, coffee and cream as a combination. It's very bad for you. It's dangerous.
Yeah, the him like conducting and stuff didn't really do anything for me, but that side of it. And then the other one I really liked, just because it was like funny and kind of implied that he committed stock fraud, was the tip.
Yeah.
Like it's such a bizarre sequence.
Whatever you say, Glenn. You know, I have to confess, you were my only client who made a buck last week, and a pretty good one, too.
Yeah, which I mean, it must be based on a true story, right?
I mean, it has
to, because
be.
Otherwise it's so out of place and whatever. But yeah, basically, like, he passes on a stock tip to these people and creates a bubble.
Yeah,
in the stock
he
market.
Basically, he kind of manipulates the stock market successfully.
Yep.
And I think part of why I liked it is because it's one of the few segments where something happens and there's like a clear beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah.
And this is a very plotless film, so it's just like that's kind of a nice breather in this. What about you? Which ones did you enjoy?
Yeah, so Gould Meets Gould was definitely like the first one where I was like, okay, I'm digging the vibe of this movie. And, again, it's like you never see that sort of thing in a biopic. I think pretty much all of my favorite ones were playing with the fantasy aspect of this, of just like things that can't really happen. So that was the first one that really got my attention. I also really liked Questions with No Answers, which is...
which one was that?
So that vignette, it's like several interviewers asking questions, presumably to Glenn Gould, but you don't ever hear the responses.
Glenn Gould, Glenn Gould, Glenn Gould.
One more question, if I may, out of curiosity.
Oh, right. That's the one where you see New City Hall.
Yeah. There's a great shot of Toronto City Hall and a guy in a phone booth right next to it. Yeah. It really looks like they only had one phone booth for this entire production and they just moved it to different locations.
Sure does.
But I just felt like the rhythm of that one was really great. And to me, it kind of encapsulated the whole movie, right? Of like, why would you do this sort of format for a biopic? It's because there are questions with no answers, right? It's like, we have all these questions about Glenn Gould. Who is Glenn Gould? What are the people asked about his sexuality? What, like all of these different things. And he's just an enigma. And so this format gives room for him to be that enigma.
Totally.
I also really liked, there's one that's just called Pills, which is another one of those really like aesthetically driven ones, which I think works really well. And it's just close-ups of pharmaceuticals with a voiceover of him just reading out like what the pills are, what they do, and sort of the instructions of like how you should use them and how you should not. And like within, I think maybe 2, you very quickly get the joke, which is that he's taking all these pharmaceuticals that do not interact well with each other.
No.
Right, at all. Like you're explicitly not supposed to take them together, and he's taking all of them at the same time. And so it tells you a lot about Glenn Gould. It's aesthetically beautiful, and there's a sort of a very dark humor to it too. So I thought that was super effective. And then the last one that I thought was really great was there's actually 2 segments that I kind of feel like work together near the very end of the movie. And this one's called Leaving. You're watching Glenn Gould driving at night. It's rainy, and he's listening to the radio, and you can hear the piano playing, right? And of course, given what the movie's about, you assume you're probably listening to Glenn Gould, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually he pulls over into an alley and gets into a phone booth, the same phone booth we've seen for this whole movie. And he calls someone up and says, like, listen to what's on the radio. And he, like, puts the phone over to the car and is, like, passing it on to this person. And then you hear the song end, and I think it maybe fades to black. And you hear the radio announcer basically say, like, that Glenn Gould died earlier that day.
Right.
Right. Again, it's sort of playing on the fantasy of the movie. This didn't really happen. It's not biographical, but it's something that Glenn Gould would do. And it's kind of this like ghostly moment. It may have been right after an interview where someone talked about him calling them up, and, you know, he would always call and like talk a bunch about like random stuff and would never stop talking. And so it just felt like a really good way to get at that loss of Glenn Gould in these people's lives. And then that goes right into the sequence of the Voyager spacecraft taking off.
Yeah.
Which is like, again, just super aesthetic. And that's the very end of the movie. And it kind of gives you a really good encapsulation of why this guy was important. Because when we were trying to figure out how you represent humanity, we put one of his recordings on this golden disc and shot it into space. I thought that was just a really strong ending to the movie. It left a really good taste in my mouth. So I was happy about that.
On the other hand, what didn't leave a good taste in your mouth, Nathan?
Okay, well, I mean, like, I think, you know, besides the sort of structure being maybe a little bit overambitious in the number of things that it includes, I think the other big Achilles heel of this movie is that they made a decision, which I understand, to never show Colm Feore, who plays Glenn Gould, playing the piano.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they probably felt like, number one, that's like maybe a respectful thing of not trying to kind of impersonate this really incredible pianist with an actor. But also, like, it may just be that, you know, he was known for his incredible piano playing. And so it may just be that it would have been very hard to find someone who could properly keep up and encapsulate the performance. And
I think not only known for his incredible performance, but like a very unique style of performance. We sort of alluded to this before. He famously would like hum while he was playing, and you could hear on the recordings he's humming, and it's not like he's humming along to the music necessarily. He's sometimes just like humming other stuff unrelated. Like they sort of show it at one point. He has this like chair that I guess his mother or his father or someone made this chair for him when he was a young boy, and he used that chair throughout his entire career. But he sat like lower than you normally do when you play the piano. I read that it's more like he would, instead of pressing on the keys, he was more pulling them down. So it's like, I think to your point, it's just like, how are we going to teach this person to replicate this very unique style of performance? It would be very difficult. It's easier just to avoid it entirely.
Right. And like, I totally get all of that. And also, I think it's a weakness of the film. This is a biopic about a pianist, and you don't see anyone play the piano in it.
Yeah.
And so instead, what they often do in these scenes is they will have Colm Feore, God bless him, he's putting on a great show. Literally, this movie would not work if he wasn't incredible in this, because he's in every single scene. He's like one of the strongest actors on the screen. But he's being asked to basically like dance to the music and sort of conduct and move his arms in this very expressionistic kind of way. And I just don't think that those scenes really work for me, especially when you've seen a couple of them. I'm kind of like, okay, all right, I get it. So those were the ones I think that really felt less exciting to me. And then the other one that, again, it just felt really like a heritage minute for me was the LA concert, right? Mostly because it just had the perfect structure for a heritage minute.
It really did.
He's getting ready for this concert. He's like meeting this guy who works backstage, and he wants an autograph, and then he gives an autograph, and then the guy reads the autograph, and it's like Glenn Gould at his final performance in Los Angeles, blah blah blah. Right?
Yeah. Well, doesn't he even say something like "enjoy this"? Like, I'm never doing this again, or something like he has some sort of heritage minute sort of line of
April 10th, 1964. Best of luck in your new career, Glenn Gould. The final concert.
Right. just the way that it sort of built to that one line, I was like, wow, this would be the Glenn Gould Heritage Minute, right? Of just
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, Glenn Gould never played again, but he produced X many recordings over the course of the rest of his career and wrote many important articles about media, blah, 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 right? Like, it made me giggle a little bit, and I don't think that was the intent. So anyway,
yeah.
What about you? Did you have any that you kind of felt like were not as strong?
Yeah, I mean, I can't honestly pinpoint exactly, though. During Diary of One Day, my only note is I'm very much losing interest at this point, cool visuals aside. And so I think from like that point on, I started to check it. Like it was just, and that was based on my count, which again may or may not be correct. That was segment 24. So I was like, okay, are we getting close to wrapping this thing up? Like it started to feel like the premise was running out of steam. And granted, as you alluded to, like a couple of really good bits come at the end, but it felt like we're now into the filler of we're trying to get to that 32 number.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really doing it for me, but
yeah, for sure. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about Colm Feore, because again, like he's carrying this movie. He's a Canadian treasure. I mean, in my opinion. So, but what do you think about Colm Feore?
Oh yeah, I mean, like this movie doesn't work without him. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't other actors that could have pulled this off, but like as you sort of alluded to, like he literally is carrying the entire thing on his back. Like he's the one sort of through line throughout all of this. Again, I don't know Glenn Gould well enough to know if it's a decent impression. It might not be, but I don't care. He feels enough of what my impression of Glenn Gould is that I assume it's a good impression. So he is kind of like a Canadian legend. And so it makes sense that he's the one playing a Canadian legend. Though I don't know his history well enough to know if he's considered legendary before this or if this sort of helps cement the sort of legendary status.
Yeah, you know, it's a little bit of an interesting story of like how he gets involved with this. So when they cast him in this, he was playing Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet at Stratford Festival.
Okay.
And they went over and found him, and he basically continued acting in 3 plays 6 days a week while they were shooting this movie.
Right. So for those who are not familiar with the Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario, everything's in repertory. So basically all of the actors are in multiple shows playing multiple parts. So it's like you're not just doing Romeo and Juliet every night. You're doing Romeo and Juliet, and then the next day you might be doing King Lear, and then the next night you might be doing Guys and Dolls, which is just absolutely insane to me as a person who wanted to be an actor for many, many years. I cannot imagine keeping multiple shows in your brain at once.
Totally.
Like I don't know how they do it. It's so incredibly impressive.
100%. I have no idea how you managed to do that, but that's what he was doing at this point. Before this, he'd done a lot of like TV movies, some shows, honestly, like nothing that really jumped out at me. A lot of biopic stuff, a lot of history stuff. This movie, I think, was definitely part of his rise to like greater notoriety, I think.
Right.
One fun fact, as they were sort of like preparing for this role, apparently Gerard and Feore spent an hour lying together under a grand piano at the Royal Conservatory to try to understand the instrument and Glenn Gould.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
That sounds like 100% an acting exercise our grade 9 acting theater teacher would have made us do.
Yes.
In addition to various other things we are not going to get into in this podcast.
Yes. We'll leave that there. But yeah, I mean, like, he has a really interesting career, especially after this. Because like
he was on Street Legal. Sorry, I'm just pulling up his filmography. Street Legal was a show that my parents loved on the CBC.
Okay, there you go.
My mom might have actually also worked on it. I'm not sure. But yeah.
There you go.
Okay,
so
cool.
And that was before this?
1992. So yeah, it would have been the year before.
Okay, there you go. But like after this, he has been working his ass off, right?
Yeah, I'm literally just pulling up his filmography on Wikipedia, and it's just like I'm still scrolling.
Yeah, so like I counted it up. 171 roles since 1980. So the dude's doing about 4 roles a year, and that's not separating out like TV where he might have a recurring role.
Right. Yeah.
So like he's working a lot. And again, I kind of wanted to like categorize what has he done, because the thing that's crazy is he's been in this pretty obscure-ish Canadian art film. He was also the villain in Thor.
He was?
Yes.
Like the first Thor movie?
Yes. He is the frost giant or whatever, the main frost giant in Thor.
Whoa, I didn't know that. Well, I mean, I've never seen Thor, so that like makes sense that I don't know that, but like still, that's wild.
So it's just like he's had this really wide career, but when you break it down, these are the sort of threads that I can see, right? Is like, number one, he does a lot of CanCon, right? So we've been talking about Heritage Minutes. He is the guy in the Flanders Fields one.
No, okay, there you go.
There you go. He was in The Wrong Guy. Have you seen that movie?
The Wrong Guy. Isn't that the Mark Wahlberg movie?
No, that's I think maybe The Wrong Guys.
Oh, with Dave Foley.
Yes.
I have not seen this, but I've heard it is phenomenal.
It is great. I love this movie, and it has a Simpsons connection because it is, if I'm not mistaken, it is written by Jay Kogan.
It is written by Jay Kogan. He's one of the 3 writers credited.
Yep. So, would highly recommend that. But you can also see Colm Feore there. Right. He played Trudeau in the TV movie. The Trudeau Senior, I guess we need to say.
I remember when that happened, and that was like a big deal. I remember there was a girl in our grade 9 English class. I'm not going to say their name out of respect, but I remember when we were like going around asking, because this is what you do in grade 9 arts package English. We were asking everyone like, who's your favorite actor? Who's your favorite director? Blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And she said her favorite actor was Colm Feore, and then referred to him as being the sexiest man on the planet.
There you go.
Now, let's be clear. Colm Feore, he's youngish in this movie, but by this point would have been like 2002, 2003 when he's playing Pierre Elliott Trudeau Sr. Not someone I would normally put in world's sexiest man category.
Especially if you're a grade 9 girl who's interested in men. I mean, surprising for sure.
It was a choice.
But you know, the thing is, he's incredibly talented, right?
Yes.
So maybe that's the thing.
And he's very charming.
Yeah. The other thread, I would say, is sort of period dramas of various kinds, right? Pearl Harbor, he's in Chicago. Not exactly a drama, but period.
Great movie.
Great movie. Changeling. The
great movie.
Yep. Going back further, we have The Borgias. We have King Lear. He's in House of Cards, which, not exactly period, but more in the sort of political drama thriller, kind of Shakespearean. And Richard III. And he's playing the title roles, of course, in King Lear and Richard III. And then the other thread is action movies.
Right.
Like big American action movies, like Face Off, The Insider, Sum of All Fears. He's also, I believe, the villain in The Chronicles of Riddick.
Okay.
Go figure. Lead role in Bon Cop, Bad Cop. Thor, Jack Ryan Shadow Recruit.
Good movie.
Yeah, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and a big role in The Umbrella Academy. So
the other thread that I'm noticing here is that he's basically in every Hollywood production that happened to shoot in Toronto or Vancouver in the 2000s.
That's an important thread.
Because that seems to be the overlap here is like, we're shooting a movie in Toronto or we're shooting a movie in Vancouver. Who can we get? Local talent?
Hell yeah.
Let's get that guy.
Hell yeah. And every time he shows up, I'm happy.
He's always good.
He's always good.
I forgot he was in The Insider, and you're right. He's great in The Insider. Yeah. I just rewatched that movie recently, and he is really good in that.
Yeah, he's got a lot of different like tones that he can hit. He can be kind of like the uptight asshole guy, or he can be like pretty smooth and very charismatic. And so he's got a lot of different ways he can play things. But I also feel like he's kind of like a great dad movie actor in a lot of ways.
100%.
Right? Lots of respect for Colm Feore. I think he's killing it here. Again, I don't have great context either about like, is this an accurate Glenn Gould? But I think he definitely is capturing the spirit of like what people want to think of Glenn Gould. And in a lot of ways, that's more important, I think, in this movie, especially because it is all about the myth of Glenn Gould as much as anything else. It doesn't come to any conclusions about who he was in his internal life.
Yeah, no, I think he absolutely carries the film and is, for me anyway, one of the key highlights. And yeah, like he makes the film kind of worth watching. Well, that brings us to one of my favorite segments of the show, the parts that seem like Simpson jokes but aren't. Nate, is there anything that stood out to you as being particularly Simpson-esque?
Yeah, so I mean, like the thing that jumps out to me is just that like a lot of people are talking about like the fact that Glenn Gould had this habit of kind of like talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. Actually, one of the better interviews that you get is this guy telling this story of like when Glenn Gould called him and he like literally just fell asleep listening to him talk and then woke up and he was still talking and he hadn't noticed that this guy had fallen asleep. It's very Grandpa Simpson, right? He just has these long rambling stories that, you know, admittedly, they're more about like media theory and the lines between the audience and the composer are blurring and things like that than like, you know, wearing an onion on your belt. But I do feel like he's got a bit of like Grandpa Simpson energy. So,
and in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 B's for a quarter, you'd say.
What about you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a relatively humorless film. I wouldn't say I chuckled all that much, but there was a great line, and I don't remember the context for it, but at some point he says, "Oh, I just don't like the sound of piano music that much." And that made me kind of laugh. And that felt kind of Simpson-y, like the sort of bait and switch or something like that. There's just, yeah, exactly. You know how I love a good switcheroo gag. But it's... This is by no means the worst movie that we've watched on the show, but it is probably the least Simpson-y movie. And it does not come across as surprising to me that the only thing that was parodied was the title, because I don't really think there's a lot of room here that's ripe for parody.
No, I agree. I think that the title is probably the right thing to parody. You know, you mentioned liking the segment The Tip, right? Mm-hmm. And I did feel like that also was something that felt like it could have been like a Simpsons plot almost.
Yeah, it has a little Simpson energy.
This idea of just like creating a stock bubble and kind of the way that everyone gets kind of tricked into it and like going along with this story felt a bit.
It's the purple monkey dishwasher of everything.
Yeah, exactly. Purple monkey dishwasher. Exactly. So like I did feel like that was the one segment, if I had to choose one, that had like a little bit of that energy.
Totally. Well, how did this movie do? Was it successful? Was it a box office triumph or a box office bomb?
So this is another area where it's like you have to judge it by Canadian standards. Right. And I don't mean that. I'm not trying to say like therefore lower standards. I just mean that like the way we think about box office is different when you're thinking about Canadian movies than American movies. So again, the budget was like $1.8 million. The domestic box office was $1.3 million, and that includes US and Canada.
Okay.
So it didn't make back its budget in the box office. But again, like part of the deal that Rhombus made was also about TV rights and all that kind of stuff. So like it's hard to know whether exactly financially this is a success or not. And because, you know, the government is paying for it and then like CBC, another government entity, is airing it probably.
Yeah.
And like all of that, it gets a little muddy, honestly, to like know like how successful this was. But I think it got a lot of attention, and especially for Canadian film of the time, that was probably very exciting for people that like, again, Roger Ebert is talking about it on TV. That's probably a sign that like for a Canadian film of this era, like you've made it, like it's in the discourse.
Yeah.
So I would say it's fairly successful. Again, the title's parodied on The Simpsons. I mean, for a Canadian film of this era, definitely a success. I can't think of another one that makes it on The Simpsons of this time.
I mean, The Fly, it is a Canadian film, but I don't think people think of it as a Canadian film necessarily, or at least in the same way. So I think that's probably the only other one that comes to mind to me.
Yeah, totally. I'm sure there are like a few others, but yeah, it's few and far between. So I'd say that's a mark of success in and of itself. It's kind of interesting to just, again, look at like what the other movies were that were popular in this year. So again, this is the year that Jurassic Park comes out.
Okay, yeah. Couldn't be a more different film, but...
Right. Other top movies of the year, you have The Fugitive, The Firm, Sleepless in Seattle, and Mrs. Doubtfire. And, like, just thinking about those movies, it just tells you how out of step Canadian cinema is at this moment with the American box office. And again, that's not necessarily, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's just like, wow, it's shocking how different this movie feels than those movies. Definitely more in the same vein, I'd say, as like other foreign films that you might see in the foreign language category at the Oscars. Unfortunately, this movie did not win any Academy Awards, of course. Not that surprising, again, because, it's not competing for that foreign language film. I did also pull the Genie Awards, since those were on the back of the VHS tape from this year.
Yes, of course.
These were the other nominees for Best Picture and Best Director, which I thought would be fun to pull again for our audience. I expect that probably no one has heard of any of these, but we'll see. Maybe not. And maybe I'd be curious, Adam, if any of these jump out to you as well. So we have La Florida. We have Harmony Cats.
Okay.
We have The Lotus Eaters, which that one's the one that the title rings a bell to me, and I can't remember why. I think that one might be on maybe feel like there was a list of the 100 best Canadian films of all time recently that maybe someone put out, and I think The Lotus Eaters was on that. The Sex of the Stars.
Okay.
And Calendar.
Great. Yep, never heard of any of those.
So, again, God bless. I just think it's interesting to kind of contextualize that like, you know, you have these other movies. These are the other ones that were in contention for the top Canadian Film Prize. None of them make that crossover to being parodied on The Simpsons, right? This movie achieved escape velocity.
Yeah.
You know, like the Voyager, it is out there. So yeah, but what about you? I mean, like Roger Ebert, like this, he gave it 4 stars. But what about you, Adam? Did the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Would you recommend this film?
Do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Yes. Would I recommend it? Probably not. I mean, it depends on the audience or who I was making the recommendation to. You know, I'm not going to tell my wife to watch this movie. I'm not going to tell most of my friends to watch this movie. But if you're the kind of person who is into Canadian cinema or art house cinema or just a big Glenn Gould head, I guess, it's not to say that there's nothing to enjoy here. But it's a very unique film that is not going to be to most people's tastes, and therefore it's hard to recommend it as a result. Sometimes it's great to be challenged, and there are films that I think aren't to most people's taste, but I think is worth them trying to get outside their comfort zone. I don't think this is one.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, I would say, yes, I agree that the strengths outweigh the weaknesses. In terms of who I would recommend this to, I would say that if you're sort of well versed in the world of music, like classical music or new music, especially anything like that, you might find this like quite an interesting film. Obviously, if you know Glenn Gould, like if you're like, oh yeah, that guy, then this would be an interesting way to kind of unpack him. You probably will get more out of this film by like read the Wikipedia first and then watch the movie, and then you'll be like, oh, that's a really interesting way to interpret this guy and his life. I think there's a big barrier to entry, I think is what you're saying as well. It's just like, if you're coming into this cold, I think you're going to find this movie very challenging. Whereas the more sort of prep you have for like what to expect and the context of who this person is, the more I think you're going to enjoy this and be like quite interested with how they've interpreted it. Because again, like if you're a fan of biopics, this is also like quite a good deconstruction of the biopic, and you might find that interesting too.
I think that comes down to my ultimate criticism is that based on the research that I've done, it seems like Glenn Gould is a very interesting guy, but I'm not sure the film does a very good job of showing how or why.
I kind of even read that. I feel like it's some of the background for this is that like it's assuming very much that you already think he's an interesting guy. And in fact, you might think he's like really eccentric and off-putting even or whatever. And they're almost trying to like tone that down and make him more approachable and human.
Yeah.
But like if you don't have that context, it's like they're correcting against something that you may not even be thinking.
Exactly.
So yeah, all that to say, like, yeah, I think for the right person, you may get a lot out of this, but it's a narrow group of people and the barrier to entry is quite high.
I wonder what your brother would think of this movie.
I asked him about it. He said that he watched it a long time ago, doesn't remember it super well. And he was like, yeah, I think Glenn Gould's super interesting. I think there's like a lot of baggage around him, all the things we've been saying about like the way that he's presented because he's Canadian and we're Canadian.
Right.
Right. Like his importance to Canadian culture and that kind of thing. That's maybe like a little bit overblown, but that doesn't diminish his accomplishments or like how unique he was. It's just all intertwined together. You can't unpack it when you grew up in it. So, Adam, what about extra credit? Are there any double features that you would recommend with this movie?
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends on what you're going for. If you want to see another great, well, at least in my memory anyway, leading performance from Mr. Colm Feore, you should check out Bon Cop, Bad Cop. I remember really liking it when I saw it. It's an interesting movie because it's bilingual. It's both in English and French. They jump back and forth between the two languages very fluidly, like, you know, a bilingual person living on the border of Quebec and Ontario probably would. And certainly if you've ever been to any of those border towns, like you've heard this and you've probably done this. So it's a police procedural, and I always enjoy those. It's a comedy, so I also enjoy those. So yeah, I remember it being really good. I also would recommend the films of Matt Johnson. Again, he directed Blackberry. I think, because if you want to get into more contemporary Canadian cinema, I think he's a really interesting filmmaker working right now. But the reason I would suggest him is because his films are all about sort of deconstructing the sort of formula, or like his first film, The Dirties, is a found footage movie about a high school shooting. And his second film is a found footage movie about faking the moon landing. And then Blackberry is obviously a, quasi biopic. I don't really know what the term for those kind of movies is.
I think maybe we were talking about this on the podcast or maybe just by text, but it's that sort of like product origin story.
I think we referred to it in our Oscar special as a product origin story. But again, it's sort of deconstructing those forms and playing with those forms, which this film is sort of, again, this is kind of deconstructing the biopic. So I think there's some nice parallels there. And I think he's a brilliant filmmaker. I think those films are well liked within the circle that know them, but I think they are not well known enough.
Totally.
So I highly recommend those. And then if you want an interesting biopic that kind of plays with the form, one of my favorites of the last decade is Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic, because it calls it right out on the poster. It's a musical fantasy. It's the thing that turns a lot of people off, is that it is not a traditional biopic. It is very much a movie musical that happens to tell the life story of Elton John and plays fast and loose with the facts and the timeline and the chronology. But it's not really interested in that because it's more interested in telling a musical story. It was interesting watching that movie, which came out so close to Bohemian Rhapsody, which was a very traditional biopic, which I just found it kind of bland and boring, and it sanded off all the edges of this person. Whereas Rocket Man doesn't shy away from the dark side of Elton John's life and, in fact, plays up some of that stuff. But it does it all through his music, and, people break out into song randomly. I think it's a really, really interesting film that maybe you have to be an Elton John fan, and I'm a big Elton John fan, so I loved it. But
I am not, and I really enjoyed that movie as well. I thought it was
okay. So there you
just
go.
Really, everything you're saying. It's a really interesting way to think about a biopic.
How about you? What would you sort of pair with this?
Yeah, so it's honestly, it's kind of a tough one because it is a pretty unique movie. I have not seen I'm Not There, so I can't really recommend it, but I'm going to add it to my watch list as like a good
totally.
comp. But the movie that actually came to mind for me is another piece of Canadian content that I believe we saw together in theaters, maybe at TIFF.
It was my very first TIFF experience.
Oh, so The Tracy Fragments is the movie.
Yes.
I feel like this is a movie that probably nobody
probably nobody has seen this movie.
Probably no one talks about it anymore, but I remember really enjoying it. It's a movie that I really don't know at all if it would hold up at home, because it feels like it was so built around the theatrical experience. So basically, this is a movie by Bruce McDonald, another Canadian director. Probably the movie that most people would actually know that he did is a movie called Pontypool.
I feel like that one kind of crossed over.
Yeah, again,
because it's a horror genre. So yeah, but it's it's the horror thing.
Yeah,
genre
it
doesn't matter
helps.
where those come from. Yeah,
Totally.
Genre really helps.
Totally. But yeah, so this movie, The Tracy Fragments, stars Elliot Page, and they play a 15-year-old who's looking for their brother. It's one of those after hours types things of following them through the city and all of these things that are going on. But the interesting thing about this movie is that it makes extensive use of split screen. At any given moment in time, you probably have at least 2 and up to 30 little like segments of the screen that are all showing different aspects of what's going on in the scene. It's just, again, it's kind of a deconstruction of filmmaking. Again, split screen, actually a very Canadian approach to film, pioneered at Expo 67 in Montreal, along with IMAX.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, again, playing off of this long Canadian history of like contributions to film, deconstructing the medium, and just like another great Canadian director, Canadian talent on screen. So I would be very curious to revisit that one at home. I have not seen it since we saw it in theaters together, but I have very fond memories of it. Do you remember that experience? What do you think of that movie?
Oh, of course I remember that experience. So the other thing I was going to recommend and then ultimately didn't because it's a TV series, but I alluded to it earlier, is Regenesis. I became familiar with Elliot Page from their performance on the first season of Regenesis, instantly became super fan. This was before Juno. Juno was actually the same year as the Tracy Fragments. Wow. They had 2 films at TIFF that year, and obviously Juno was like the breakout role for them that, you know, completely changed the course of their career. But we couldn't get tickets to Juno. We stood in the rush line and got in, and we sat. This is the craziest part, was we sat in the front row.
Oh my God.
For this movie. And so, like, this is a movie that's split screen, so you kind of want to have a good field of view, but we're literally as close to the screen as you possibly could be. I remember my neck was so sore. But the thing that was so exciting was that when they did the Q&A, we were like literally, you know, a couple feet from the cast and the crew, including Elliot Page. So I was just over the moon because that's why I was there.
Yeah.
Didn't really care about the movie in the end. But I do remember the movie being like really interesting. And then the other thing that was really interesting about it was that I remember the filmmakers actually put all the raw footage online and encouraged people to download it and recut it and remix it and do all these fun things. And I did that. I downloaded it and subsequently used up all of my bandwidth for our residents that doing so. And I was blocked from the internet for like 4 days.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that's my memories of the Tracy Fragments, but it was a fond memory for me, and it was my very first TIFF experience, and I've retold that story to multiple people at the organization subsequently. And actually, it turns out that 32 Short Films did play the festival in 1993 as a gala presentation. So I imagine it would have premiered there, but certainly it was part of the festival, and that explains why TIFF ultimately did the restoration, 10 years ago or whatever it was. So
right. But it might have been part of how it took off as well. I would be surprised because it just TIFF does have that audience.
And that was prior to TIFF being known as TIFF. That was back when it was still known as the Festival of Festivals. Yeah. So maybe that's even where Ebert saw it, because he is a longstanding visitor to Toronto for the festival. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's how he became aware of it. But yeah, well, that's 32 short films about Glenn Gould, but we're not done with 22 short films about Springfield, because next week we have a very exciting episode, because we will be coming back to the episode in question to chat with one Mr. Bill Oakley, as well as talk about Pulp Fiction.
Hot damn.
So that is something that I am very, very, very excited about. I still can't believe it's happening. It's going to be super, super fun, super exciting. So we really hope you come back for that episode. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review. It really does make all the difference in the world. And share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. I'll be honest, this film is probably not going to have a great deal of appeal with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life, but who knows? It's such a deep cut, and you learn a lot about something like that.
Pass it on to your Canadian film fans.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Anyways, until next time, Nate.
We'll see you around the Plex.
We'll see you around the Plex. And I'm going to hit record in Sound Studio as my backup. Okay. And with that, it's good to be sitting down to do this again. It's I've had time to watch a movie.
Yeah.
Barely had time to watch a movie. This is the only one. Yes, this is the only one. No, actually this and Batman's the 60s Batman.
Yeah.
Are the only two I actually watched in one sitting. Every other one, I had to break up into multiple sittings, including Rear Window, which is only an hour and 40 minutes.
Oh, man.
So that should tell you the state of my exhaustion lately.
Yeah, I feel you. I feel you. This also really would not benefit from multiple sittings.
No, it would absolutely not.
It is so about flow and all that.
Yeah, but thankfully it's also only like 90 minutes long. So I was like, okay, I think I can do this. And I did.
Cool.
Okay,
Good.
So on that note, 3, 2, 1.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.